Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second scintillating webinar on AI and writing. We started it last week. This week we've got some bits of magic. I think that was your title, Stacey, which I glommed onto. So day two, our second webinar is going to focus on bits of magic with regard to AI and writing. And I'm eating up a little bit of time to allow people to click the join button so they can join us. Today we've got Stacey Pigg from North Carolina State University with us, and we've got John Gallagher from the University of Illinois, although resident in Paris today. So we all feel really bad for him and what he's doing there. And then I'm hosting it today. I'm Jeff Grabill. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Education here at the University of Leeds. I spent most of my career as a writing teacher and professor at Michigan State, but also was at Georgia State University in Atlanta for a little bit. And that is my introduction of me. And so I'm going to turn it over to Stacey, introduce herself real fast, then John, and then we'll spend a little time with some quick overviews of what you're thinking about, what you're doing with regard to AI and writing. And we'll get to some questions from me and then from those who've joined us in the audience. So as you have questions, please use the Q&A palette, ask them. I'll manage the question and get as many of them to Stacey and John as possible. So Stacey, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Stacey Pigg. I'm a faculty member. I'm a professor in technical and scientific communication at NC State. A couple of roles I've had there recently is directing our graduate programs and also directing our undergraduate program in professional writing. So lots of ways to care about writing learning.
Thank you, Stacey. John.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois, and I've been engaged in sort of two large projects related to AI. The one is I've turned to the AI researchers to ask them about how they write, trying to sort of dig down below the hype a little bit there. And then I've turned to doing some machine learning myself. And so about 6 years ago, I started learning machine learning, which I would now call AI.
Mhm.
And so I've been using some machine learning techniques of my own to analyze large corpuses of online data. And I've recently got, interested in sort of different perceptions of how ChatGPT is being used and doing some fully experimental work with regards to people's perceptions of these technologies.
Oh, great. So actually, if you're ready, John, do you want us to want to go ahead and have you sort of lean into that work for a few minutes? And
Sure. Yeah. I'm working on one screen here, so I'm not used to that. Let me just share my screen.
we can see it.
Excellent, thank you. So I was telling everybody before the panel started that I'm in a hotel room because it's 97 degrees here in Paris, and the apartment I'm living in does not have air conditioning. So I'll give a little bit of I wanted to sort of focus today on very briefly on just sort of like how I'm thinking about audience. And one of the foundations of my research is to think about how we can better teach this idea of like consider your audience as a fundamental important element in teaching writing. And the way I've been actually doing it is to sort of reverse or invert how we think about what these technologies are doing with their text. So it's more of a corporate view of these technologies is they produce text that you can then use. I want to say, instead of saying, let's use these texts, to actually turn those texts into an object of inquiry, thinking about them as models of culture that are based on these things that these companies have scraped off the internet, Google Books and that sort of thing. So my like main takeaway from today is rather than using the technologies and the text they produce, we can think about what they're producing and what that means. And so the way I've taken this into my classroom is to actually get these machines to to take on personas, to get them to take on, adopt audience roles and personas. So getting them to take on the role of like Barack Obama, individual people, or to get them to take on the voice of a disciplinary community, right? To take on the voice of a physicist, or even be more specific, the voice and the language of a college professor physicist, or a NASA physicist, somebody like that. Um, and then to think about the differences in the output on the basis of what you kind of are typing. And so this idea of like thick audience description is something that I've been using with these tools with my students. I taught a whole class themed around AI, a tech writing class. And, we use a lot of these audience descriptions to see what they get, to think about critically what they're outputting, and then to sort of how the outputs change on the basis of what we input into them. And so, I don't want to take up too much more time, because I know we want to keep a lot of time for good questions and discussion. But this is actually an example from my class. For those of you who are familiar with the University of Illinois, a huge employer of the University of Illinois is Archer Daniel Midland. ADM, they're a huge employer in the state of Illinois. So a lot of my students apply to ADM jobs. And so one of the things that we started doing was trying to sort of apply for a job at ADM, for a resume or a cover letter. And then we instruct the generative AI to take on a particular role. So I say here, take on the role and persona of a hiring manager at ADM. And then we instructed the machine, you have over 50 years of experience. What are you looking for in a job candidate? And then here's another way of doing it. Your ADM algorithm, for those of you who are familiar, when, jobs are so important now that they get so many applications that they use algorithms to sort resumes. So we had said, take on the role of an algorithm that is parsing an applicant's resume at ADM. You have over 1,000 applications. What are the values and the ways you would parse a resume? And then to, be a little bit even more specific, like I actually really stress that these thick audience persona descriptions, sometimes we blow them up to 500 or even 1,000 words, so we'll also sometimes add details about an ADM location, research about ADM hiring managers on LinkedIn, and even specific departments, and then even being more specific about an ADM algorithm, we can add details from the job description, specific or general. And that's kind of the main takeaway that I want to sort of leave people with, is that rather than sort of valuing the text as an object that students are going to use and turn in as their own, actually to turn that text into an object of inquiry to examine, to reflect on. And I think this gets us out of some of the weirder, stickier ethical situations where it's like, oh, this is plagiarism, this is unethical to use. Well, then we're not even using it, right? We're actually using it as an object of inquiry. We can call out the biases, right? I'll just go off on a little bit of a tangent, but sometimes I use ChatGPT to actually help me tell my kids wild bedtime stories, because it's really good, actually. All those hallucinations are really good for children's bedtime stories about making stuff up. My children are two girls, but they have boys' names, specifically for resume algorithm tracking systems that my spouse and I decided on. But it thinks that my children's names are boys. And so whenever I give it my children's names, it always gives them he's and hims and turns them into brothers. And I never tell them, I never correct it, but like it allows us to sort of, when we treat it as an object of analysis, it allows us to sort of call out those biases that are happening with it. In a way that's not saying like, we're just going to accept the text as is. We're going to turn it into an object of reflection and inquiry. And then we do that through the use of creating audience personas. All right, I think I may be going a little bit too long there, but I'll stop now.
It was great, John. No, thank you. And this notion of hallucinations has always been really interesting to me. It's as if we don't hallucinate as human beings, or make things up. As we talk about in my family of origin, my wife accuses me of telling stories that aren't true, but I haven't told a story that's not true. That some of the details are wrong, right? But
Yeah.
I might have made a few things up, but the truth value of the story was there. So anyway, so I won't go on because we want to hear from Stacey. So Stacey, a little bit from you, please.
Sure. Let me find my little slides here. All right, that's me. You already know me. So I'm here, this will pair really well with John, I think. I'm here to convince you or to talk to you a little bit about why we might care about what students are learning about generative AI from beyond classroom spaces. Obviously, we all care a lot about how to make the best and most effective learning experiences for students within our classrooms, but we also know that they come to us with a lot of we could call it baggage. Sometimes it's baggage, sometimes it's really productive, but they come to us with a lot of learning from outside the classroom. And so one of my interests has been to try to understand and map what are the learning ecologies that exist for the use of generative AI as it applies for writing outside the classroom. And, one way that I've started to try to learn about those learning ecologies is to watch a lot of TikTok and YouTube videos. So that has been some of my fun and research for the last couple of years. I did more than just watch TikTok and YouTube, though. That was a fun part of this research. But I did 2 recent descriptive content analysis kind of projects. And so, what I was doing is just trying to understand what's out there and how can we describe what's out there. And so I've got a link to you here for one of the articles that I've published from this research. But basically, I curated a set of 35 online tutorials that are demonstrating and visually depicting how to use ChatGPT for research writing specifically. And I took those from YouTube, TikTok. Happy to talk more about where I found them and how I chose the ones I chose. But they're sort of halfway split between students demonstrating their own processes in order to teach peers how to use these tools and folks who would be probably described as influencers or content creators who already had a platform for sharing learning and are likely trying to monetize their skills, who have created tutorials for folks to learn how to use these tools effectively. And so I looked at them in 2 ways. First, just what are the interactions that we can see between people and ChatGPT that are visually depicted in these tutorial videos? And then 2, how do the tutorials frame the purpose of generative AI for research writing? Why do they seem to assume that we would care about or want to bring these tools in to our processes? And so I'm going to start first just by telling you a little bit about what I learned about what I saw about the actual interactions depicted between folks using ChatGPT and ChatGPT itself. The first thing for you to know is that generative AI was depicted as relevant and useful throughout all phases of research writing, from initial stages even of formulating research methodologies, designs, ideas, all the way through the process of writing methodology sections, results sections, creating tables, all the way into proofreading, editing, and also even translating academic prose for particular public audiences. And I came up with really 3 ways after a long coding process that I can again talk to you much more about. I came up with 3 basic ways to describe how I saw the interactions between people and ChatGPT depicted. The first was requesting. So people were often requesting something from ChatGPT, and they requested lots of different things, as you can imagine. People were sometimes evaluating the returns from ChatGPT, and you could see this because they would talk through the way that they responded to what was returned to them from ChatGPT as a tool. And then they were also refining. So they were working from that evaluation of what they had requested in order to ask for more information or to improve something or to change something about, the way that they were writing for the research that they were working on. So I can talk about these much more, of course. For the second point, how are these tutorials framing what ChatGPT is for within research processes? And overall, again, after coding these videos and the discourse in these videos, there were about 5 key themes that I found around which the conversation about why we would use ChatGPT in research writing, sort of centered. And those were as a drudge or, a tool that helps us offload menial or laborious tasks that we don't want to do, an accelerator, a way to speed up our research processes, a starting point, a way to start instead of from a blank page or which seems very scary to many of us, to start more as an editor of content rather than an originator of content, a corrective or a way to fix or eliminate human errors, or a proxy. And by proxy, I mean they're a stand-in for human knowledge. And it's notable in most of these tutorial videos, when generative AI was discussed as a proxy, it was often in the negative. So as to say, ChatGPT cannot stand in for human knowledge. It cannot stand in for what you should know as a researcher. And so, one way to talk about this generally is that, generative AI was really depicted as enhancing existing human knowledge capacities, especially accelerating research processes and taking over mundane tasks. And you won't be surprised to hear that. I have another slide.
Sure you do.
I swear I do. It's a good one.
Ask AI.
Well, anyway, I have another slide.
Another slide.
It might show up in a minute, but what it says basically is that this was a very high overview of work that I've been doing, and I'm happy to talk to you about any part of it. But I think what's sort of interesting here is to see the way that these early adopters in the tutorials position generative AI as just a tool, and they use this phrase all the time. And the idea there is it extends human practices or existing human knowledge, rather than contributing by, redefining knowledge or, really sort of changing the possibilities or capacity for knowledge. And, over and over again, these tutorials emphasize that extensive knowledge and evaluation is needed in order to use them effectively or ethically, which is really interesting because the tutorials are also really aimed at audiences of people who are struggling or who are having trouble with research practices or processes. And so there's a sense in which the sort of expectations for effective use of the tools does not line up very well with the expectations for audience, in which we might assume that the folks using these tutorials are not only looking for ways to, become more productive, but also to learn basic research practices. Second point I wanted to bring up is that this is really interesting, but early adopters in these tutorials often assume that what is mundane or menial in writing is really easily defined, so that it's really easy to know what we could easily offload to the tool versus what we couldn't. What is sort of so central to writing practice and processes that we would never want to give it away to a robot. However, the kinds of practices that were often demonstrated as offloaded to AI were things like reading or deciding on effective research methodologies. So they are very complex in terms of what we as folks who work in writing might want to claim as sort of central humanistic practices. And so there's a real complexity around what's mundane enough to be shared with ChatGPT. That's a big overview. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you, Stacey. I appreciate it. So for those of you joining us or have joined us, please use the Q&A palette for questions. I'll take questions for Stacey and John from the palette. I've got questions. We'll start with my questions. I've got loads of questions. I've got 45 minutes worth of questions, but nobody really wants me to ask 45 minutes worth of questions. So as you add questions, I'll move back and forth. Let me start with one of the fundamental questions that I'm asking in my own work, and my colleagues that who've worked on Eli are asking too, and that is just get each of your reflections on what do you think, given the role of AI in writing. So these generative intelligence are going to help us create and make things for forever, right? So I do believe that we've crossed some sort of line in which these generative intelligences will really be a fundamental part of human creativity in various ways. So what's the durable human element? What's durably human? What should we value as fundamentally or significantly human in this context, if anything? Which one of you wants to take up the durable human element first? All right, John, you went off mute first, so it's
What
yours.
what do you, I guess, what do you mean by durable?
Oh gosh, so you're not allowed to ask me a question. So what I mean by durable is that something that despite improvements in technologies, right? So these things are going to continue to get better. What are the things that are going to be fundamentally human about how we make things and share things and communicate things, regardless of technological change and advancement, if anything? Why have us would be another way to ask that question.
I don't know.
It's okay.
I
It's a
mean,
good
I
answer.
mean, there's probably a lot of things. I mean, so I mean, I really, so when I introduce it to my students, I talk a lot about this is there's I have like there's a whole tweet thread about like people like being worried about like losing their jobs, like dating back from like 1830. Um, and like why the kid and like why kids don't want to work hard and stuff like this, and it goes all the way back. Um, so I really frame I say AI is really more about trying to automate things and why do people want to automate things, like, to make a profit usually. And then what is automation? Like, and I use the example of like the great horse poop symposium of like the 1870s, which like world minds, there was so much horse poop in all of the city streets across the world. They're like, this problem is, how do we solve this? And they never solved the problem. The car just got invented. So like there's all sorts of like weird technological innovations that solve problems or that make other problems go away. So I try to avoid like any sort of technological determinism. And then usually I lead that into like this comment about like, well, what we have right now with ChatGPT is I don't think it's very good. I think it's a lot of like banal text. That's why it's much more interesting to think about it as like, why is it producing the things that it's producing in the way it is? Um, and that leads us to questions about like most of the time talking about like ChatGPT is an open AI product. Um, and but those are my answers. So I think I dodged your question, Jeff.
It's a really challenging. I don't know if I have an answer to the question. So Stacey, you get to answer it now.
I don't have an answer either. But I do think what I've noticed just from the work that I did is that this is going to be the central role for folks like us to play, or a central role, because we're going to be fighting a lot of ideas about what's okay to be automated, what is mundane, what is beyond the worry, of human critical analysis. And the other things that did always come up were the sort of evaluative lens needed, the sort of knowledge lens needed, both in terms of like what John's talking about with the sort of like critical top site of the way that the tool is positioned, you know, economically, and who it's making money for, and what that sort of critical understanding of the like cultural context for the tool and technology is, but also like with respect to the text itself and the output. And that I never think about critical analysis as being the most important moment of text generation, I guess, when I'm like writing in my everyday life. But I think that comes up repeatedly, even for the folks outside of our discipline who are giving information about how to use these tools. So I don't know. Early thoughts.
Well, let me drill a little bit
I'll,
deeper.
I'll,
Go ahead,
I'll,
John.
I'll add something there. I mean, a lot of these, when you look at what the surveys they do of these things is that like, these things aren't very good at empathy. Um, they're very good at like remembering dates, remembering like formulaic equations, right? So, I would think that like the more constrained a situation or a writing template or a writing genre is, more constrained it is, the better these things write in them. The
Yep.
less constrained, the worse they are. And that goes back to like, my research about the AI researchers, right? They wouldn't even call it AI. They only call it AI when they're trying to apply for grants. A lot of them, don't even like calling it machine learning, right? A lot of them say it's just like, probabilistic statistics. And so really these things are just good for like one particular task. And they're very good at that one particular task. But they're not good at any other task other than that thing they're designed for. And so, we can design a program that can play chess better than any other human can, but that program itself cannot do any other game. It's terrible at tic-tac-toe. And so I think what is human is the ability to move between tasks and to move between tasks with a flexible type of thinking. I think
Yeah.
that's my answer.
Well, and you put the two of your answers together, and I think that's something to revisit for those of us who are listening to this in terms of really good assignment and assessment design, because we could design things in a box that machines can do, and we do that a lot. The rare in some cases is the opportunity to ask students to invent and create and do some unstructured things, which may be the durable human thing. But before I get to a couple questions, there's some really good questions in the palette that I'll feed to you, particularly the ones that I like. But of course, but let's go a little bit deeper into what the research tells us and what we think we know and understand to be good and true and beautiful about writing instruction. And that is something like, well, if all learning and writing happens in revision, and that feedback revision loop is a virtuous loop, including the giving of feedback as much as the receiving of feedback. How does that work in a context in which machines, as we've described, can do some of the invention work for us, which may not be that big of a deal, but they can also give us some of the feedback and audience feedback work as well. How does revision and feedback work? Those really mundane, frankly, but really high impact things that we do with students. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll if you don't mind, Stacey, I'll take this. So like, I'll just draw on the experiences of like what I had my students do, right? Where we asked Chat GPT, or when they were using it's Gemini now. It changed because we started out the semester was Bard and then changed to Gemini. And we would have they would write something and then they would ask these models to give different kinds of feedback from the persona or from the perspective of different kinds of possible audiences, right? And what was interesting is that, you could ask it to give a different type of tone too. So you could ask it to give a supportive tone. You'd ask it to give like a very harsh critical tone. And you could play with this. And, they would oftentimes get stuck on, there was a certain limit, top limit at which it could critique the writing. Sometimes though, it would pick up on stuff that I wouldn't even thought of, which was really interesting, right? Especially if if you really got granular with into a particular type of discipline, where I'll give one example. I had a student who he was a junior and he was a junior chemist. He was like, in a lab, working on papers. It's incredible what undergrads do. And, he was asking it to he asked it to take on the persona of a very famous chemist and give feedback on this paper he had been working on. And it was like a very famous chemist. So there was enough stuff in the training data. He was like, yeah, it gave me some really good feedback on what I was saying. And like, I didn't even think about it. And I read it and I said, I don't even understand this, because it actually was giving like some technical feedback on the paper in a way that I couldn't have given feedback on. But he said, I never thought to ask it to take on this role of this famous chemist if it hadn't been for this discussion. So, you can ask it to give sort of this kind of feedback, but then you also have to have the knowledge to be able to critically use it or discard it. And in my conversations about peer review, I talk a lot about discarding feedback and sort of saying like, okay, you got feedback from 3 peers. One of them maybe is AI. What is good? What did you get? Put all that in. And I asked students to even write it with a pen and pencil on paper. Like, what good stuff do you want to keep? And you can discard the rest. And like, that's a really interesting moment for them, because a lot of times it's, it's the classic is like, you get people who are being overly critical, or who are, the thank you very much, overly positive, right? but it's like, trying to sort of sift through the possible kind of feedback. And that's something they're not used to doing. And it sort of, these kind of audience personas give rise to that, especially when you do it multiple times.
Yeah, the iteration matters, doesn't it? Stacey, you want to take a
Yeah.
shot?
Yeah,
The
so
virtuous feedback revision cycle?
there are a lot of things that I really liked about what I learned from doing this research and sort of trying to understand attitudes outside of what I might bring to thinking about generative AI. And one thing was the way in which the use of generative AI made the writing process so dialogic, even if that interaction was not between humans, there was a sense in which the the interaction depicted on the screen when someone is writing with generative AI does become one of back and forth. It's easy to see in some ways, even just watching across the different videos I watched, the difference between someone who is able to look at feedback critically and reflectively and then make a decision and do something with it. But even if they weren't, even if they were a new writer and they were just taking what they got on the screen and doing something with it, there was still a kind of interaction that was baked into the physical process of doing writing in this way. And I think that is I think that's going to be something that is useful to us in the long term, and that it's so difficult, I think, to help students understand that revision is not something that you save for the end of a process. It's really another way of thinking about what it means to do writing. And I think that just the sort of dynamic interplay between putting things in and getting things out, input and output, was the way I started to think about it sometimes too simply when I was coding these things. But there is something about that interplay that I like, because I want students to think about writing in that way. I don't want them to think about it as something that, they do while locked in a room and then they can bring it to others, machine or non-machine at the end of the process. And so like if that slide I showed you where I had requesting, evaluated, refining, like all of those are parts of the revision process there. Like even when they're requesting information, it's trying to, ask a question about something that's going to be done in the writing process in order to receive some feedback in some way. And so I think it's going to be really cool to think about how these things shape what it means to just conceptualize the writing process as less linear and more iterative. And there's already been some really good writing about that, and in writing studies, just to think about what that's going to look like.
No, it's interesting. Thank you both. So we've got a couple of questions I want to move to that from those who've joined us. So we have somebody who, like me, is actually interested, Stacey, in the findings about mundane things. So I've offloaded as much of my reading to AI as I can. I'm perfectly happy to let AI read for me, particularly most of the reading that I have to do. But the question is really, do you have any recommendations for how to help students think through, to reflect on what they consider mundane and why, and what they might want to think twice about before they offload it to some sort of generative technology?
I wish I had like a really good assignment sequence already worked up for this, but I really don't. I mean, I think the thing that is going to be fun about this is bringing it up for conversation, making it a part of what it means to learn about writing. And also, I want to come back to the reading thing, because it was a big deal in the way that people talk about what these tools can do. And it was a really different kind of deal for people that felt like they had a good sense of disciplinary expertise than for people that didn't. Because when you're doing something like, for example, writing a literature review for the first time, there's a way in which you can write a literature review from a sort of broad sense of the abstracts and the work that's out there. But if you don't have a sense of how to put those into a storyline, then you're really sort of lacking something there. And so I think there are also going to be ways to talk to open up conversations about what it means to do writing well by questioning some of these ideas about the mundane. It's easy to use ChatGPT to read for you if you understand where you're headed and where you've been, and you can put those things into dialogue in particular ways. So I don't have an assignment sequence for this yet, but what I imagine myself doing in a lot of different kinds of ways is using these questions as a way to try to engage students with the places they're at The other thing I'll say really quickly is that one of the other things I liked about this research is that I did think it started to give me a handle on where students were struggling in ways that I might not have understood otherwise. So I think that it was possible to see that a lot of times students were turning to generative AI, or tutorials were, depicting the use of generative AI as helpful in places where people are struggling. And I think reading is one of those, to be honest with you. It's hard for new students to, read the amount of work they need to read in order to ground research in a disciplinary context. And so this is the other thing that I think is cool about the mundane issue is that sometimes it overlaps with what's difficult. And so in those places where what's mundane and what's difficult is a little bit hard to parse apart, there's often teaching and learning that needs to be done. And so I think that those are some of the places I'll be thinking about this more.
John, did you want to take up the question of the mundane and what we offload and not, and how we think it through?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple things that I was thinking about as Stacey was talking that her pinged a lot of things in my head. So like I've used it a couple times to like remind myself what some like critical thinkers were talking about. Like sometimes I'm like, okay, what was Foucault talking about again in the history of sexuality? And like, like just to get like a brief summary to like, I remember that. And then I go use my PDF of Foucault or something like that. And so, like I was teaching a course on social media where, a student brought in like a ChatGPT generated summary of the Panopticon, and it was pretty good. Like I filled in a couple of gaps that I thought it wasn't, and then like we talked about how like social media platforms are the Panopticon, right? And then we talked about like ChatGPT being the Panopticon. So that's like one thing about like the mundane, about just like checking in, um, still seeing it as a tool. But the way I've sort of like tried to like, where do you begin with this stuff is, I think there's a hunger for like handwriting and writing by hand. So I introduced just like the idea of free writing or writing to learn and writing things by hand, as a way to like generate some ideas and a way to generate some of your thinking through. I mean, I use the idea of like, like when you get to a point in your own head where you have to externalize it so that you can move past that idea that you keep sort of recycling through in your mind, right? And in using handwriting and writing by hand, and then retyping it out into a Word document, and then sort of maybe then going to AI, to sort of generate a more dialogic kind of interaction. Because somebody had said in one of the chats about like these are chat bots, right? And it is, right? I think a lot about the interaction design is such that they're dialogue and they're a chat bot, right? There's another alternative history in which, they could have done something where they integrated Chat GPT into Microsoft Word very differently than as a chat bot, right? So it's generated as as a thing, as an agent with which we can talk to. And sometimes that's good for generating ideas, but like there are other ways to generate ideas that, are just as valuable using pen and paper, sketching out stuff that isn't constrained by, a Word document orientation.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think one of the dangers, there's a very durable idea, if you will, in rhetorical theory about the epistemic value of writing. And that is, I mean, in its mundane characterization, we don't know what we think until we try to write it, or speak it, I suppose. But I think the writing bit is harder because it slows us down in particular sorts of ways, whether we write by pen or whether we write by keyboard. I don't think it matters in this regard. And offloading those fundamental epistemic moments to a machine has some real costs in terms of the ability of human beings to discover what it is that they really think. Now, it isn't clear to me whether those things are recoverable in revision, if revision happens. But it is my first blush was, invention maybe isn't offloading invention maybe to a machine isn't that big of a deal, but I think it has pretty high costs associated with it, depending on the kind of writing you're doing and the kind of writer you are. I think we always assume that everybody's like us, and a lot of people are not. They just want to get through the writing because it's part of their day. So I got another question for you. So it's really pivoted off your work, John. So the question goes, really likes about how you talk about reversing the Gen I gaze and treating these outputs as cultural objects. inquiry. Have you faced any potential limitations for that approach in the classroom? And this questioner is thinking in particular about non-native English speakers, people not from the global north, global majority, or people not from the global north, people come from global majority parts of the world, to a predominantly white, fairly narrowly constrained giant Midwestern university like the University of Illinois or Michigan State University. So lots of diversity walks into our classroom. Any potential limitations on that approach with regard to that diversity?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of tons of limitations, right? Actually, that's a huge central discussion point of all the things that it says when you treat it. So I get this, by the way, I just want to, I got some of these ideas from Ted Underwood, who's at my university, who he talks about these things as like models of culture. And like they're modeling culture. I actually have a joke, like they're actually modeling Reddit. And people have started picking up on this, that like there are questions when you ask ChatGPT where it just, somebody had asked somewhere in the training data, in the billions of petabytes that they had trained it on, somewhere somebody had asked that exact question in a random Reddit thread, and they can find the answer. And then people answer sarcastically. So I actually sort of joke that like it's like, AI is running on like some weird random troll from 2011. So there's all sorts of ways, and people will talk about, it'll give you absolutely wrong answers. It's like, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And it's like, well, you melt the spoon first. So there's all sorts of limitations. Cultural, correctly, I would say if it's not racist, it can sort of border on racist, right? I think they've cut out some of the explicitly racist things out of the training data. It certainly is gendered, right? And it makes huge assumptions about names. We have a very large, a third of the student population is international student at UIUC. And so, I teach many of international students, and we constantly critique the North American bias of ChatGPT. And they'll even type in things that, in their native languages, and, then it gets way worse when it's not in sort of formal edited American English, and things like that. But I still think there's value in seeing and treating it like that. And that's one of the strengths in seeing, like, we're not going to use the text that it produces. We're going to critique it and reflect on it and treat it like an object of analysis. And that seems to go over with students pretty well. And I was like, and if it offers you some feedback on your writing, go for it and take it, or just ignore it. And so that's the way I've sort of largely approached it.
Stacey, do you want to take that question up as well?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing I'll just say is that I think we're going to have a complicated landscape around the way we move forward with thinking about global Englishes and the importance of dialect and the importance of, different approaches to the English language as we think about the way that students will use the, generative AI tool. And, reading about, I didn't use the word science writing particularly and talking about what I was talking about, but a lot of the tutorials that I was working with were specifically for research writing in the sciences. And there was there has been a really interesting conversation around, are these tools more helpful for allowing more access to folks from, different parts of the world who want to write in standard American English, for, providing ways to get to that endpoint more quickly without the cost of editors and so forth and so on. But at the same time, are we going to be less likely to want to publish global Englishes if we are, more likely to norm to the kinds of output that's produced by generative AI? And so I think I don't have an answer for this, but again, all I know how to do is point out the problems so that we can talk about them with our students, and so that we can, sort of try to understand where we are with respect to the effects that could come from the ways of thinking that happen when we write with these technologies. And so this is something that I talk to my students about. We too have a large international population at NC State, large amounts of our graduate students as well.
Yeah, I I was saying in this AI class that was, I mean, like every day we were talking about it and the students really liked the class. Um, I was saying to the students that like about this idea of like it's sort of like the way Chat GPT and Gemini write, it sounds like um, someone who is trying to write with academic discourse can't quite take it on effectively. I sort of really think about David Bartholomew's Inventing the University, right? It's taking on the cloak of academic discourse, but doesn't know how to use it. And it's sort of it's and but it's got that like complex syllabic constructions. It's got complex sentence structure. It doesn't mean anything, right? It's sort of like, it's a sentence that you read through on the internet and you don't, and it sounds fine the first time you read it, and the second time you read it, you go, that doesn't mean anything. And my students actually understand what I mean by this. And so I'm not worried about my students right now because they didn't learn that. What I'm concerned about are like my nephews who are sixth graders who are using this kind of technology in like a Los Angeles school district. And they are learning that this is the way I'm supposed to write. That's where I'm really concerned about is people who are learning to write and this thing is like getting integrated into their learning process. And I'm really concerned about that question that Stacey brought up about, you know, sort of like this weird edited American English getting treated as the default and the template and the way writing should look because this is what the machines have told me they should look like.
Yeah.
And the way I go back to actually, I teach we read the Chat GPT-4 technical paper. Um, and there's all sorts of weird stuff that they say in that paper when you read it carefully, about like how the data set was constructed, all the, it's like 85 pages worth of appendices about stuff. They're like, we just made these random decisions. And that's kind of how I frame the paper. It's a great paper to read. It's 100 pages long, but we read it in a week in my class. Goes over well.
Well, it's also very normal in terms those of us who've done research and have taught research. When you get under the hood about the decisions that you make as a research, some of that stuff is pretty sketchy too. But it's interesting that you brought up Bartholomew's work, because I've thought a lot about Bartholomew's work on basic writing in particular, in the last year as I've tried to listen to what's happening with regard to these intelligences and writing more broadly, but the writing classroom. So I'm going to return to the writing classroom with another question for each of you. So the fundamental question here, this good contextual build-up by the questioner. So what's our entry point? I mean, so most of the students in the first year writing classroom would rather be beaten with a stick than be in that classroom, right? We all know this. So that's a tough audience. And anyway, so what's the entry point to that, to an insecure student, to a less confident student, to a student who doesn't want to be there, who doesn't see any value in the writing class? What's our value proposition? Why would they? What is there anything about generative AI which makes this class more interesting, or less interesting, or less important to them? You got to get your first year writing program director hats on. You're selling. What do you got?
I mean, so I don't think my immediate instinct would be to go to generative AI as to how to get them to do buy-in. Um, I would, I would talk about all the statistics about, how much time people spend at their jobs writing. It ranges from like 40 to 70%.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, um, that's one way to do buy-in. I would point out all the different ways they're already doing writing, different various kinds of social media. Um, when I was at a community college, teaching like a 8-6 course load, um, one of the first weeks I would talk just about like your posture and like, I see students like wearing like wrist guards and stuff. And so I would have like a whole lesson about like, seeing these things as technology and like getting people to like record themselves and their posture, um, and getting people to like think about this as the ergonomics of writing. But I don't think I would necessarily start with generative AI. That probably wasn't where I'd start.
Stacey, you want to take it up?
I was looking at the question and the way it was written, and I think I'm interested in having more conversations too about what the expectations of current students are given their interactions with generative AI. At NC State, most of the students don't want to admit that they've ever used it before. So it's a very interesting, it's a really interesting dynamic. And I don't know if it's just our students at NC State. This is probably changing every semester with new students that come in, just because these technologies are so new. But a lot of our students, it's, maybe the attitudes are shifting, but I don't think we've fully seen that yet. And I don't know if others of you are already seeing a lot of changes. I think what I've tried to think about with this research and with mapping the ecologies for learning outside the classroom is just to try to get a handle on how the sort of cultural learning that students do when they come to us is going to shape those dispositions that they have. And as of yet, I'm not seeing a ton to indicate that students are no longer going to want to learn writing skills. Instead, what I'm seeing a lot of is an indication that students are likely to position generative text generation technologies as a way to get there faster and to get there more quickly. And I think what we're probably going to have to do in our writing courses is to teach students the importance of slowing down and the importance of interrogating, what it is that these technologies are doing, what it is that they can do for us, asking them questions about their own, literacy histories and how these things fit into them. And, I am, I think, more optimistic that in general, these technologies are going to be revolutionary in the way that they shape what writing and learning look like and creative activity look like. But I also think that I'm also trying to be cautious and not assuming that students will no longer be, interested in writing practice. And I don't know, this is a question I'd like to hear much more from other people who are working with first year students. I'm usually working with graduate students, and they come in with very similar insecurities, for research writing specifically, but a very different fear of plagiarism and they have a baggage around the idea. We actually have to convince them to try to use the generative AI because they're really afraid that it's going to get them kicked out of school, and they don't want that.
Well, yeah, there's so much that's interesting here. I mean, well, all right, I was going to go down a rabbit hole. I won't go down that rabbit hole. But I mean, I think some of the surveying that we've done here in the UK that I have some confidence in suggests that students are using it at pretty high levels, and then not necessarily admitting to it outside those surveys, not necessarily using it particularly well or knowing how to use it. But let me come back to real fast that we're running out of time. So I've got one more thing I want to ask each of you, but I have also been paying attention to the research on productivity. So there have been some really interesting studies on productivity, and not surprisingly, because this has been true for a very long time, those productivity studies are often focused on writing. And there's a longer history of researchers not interested in writing, using the act of writing as the ground on which, because there's all sorts of interesting human questions associated with that, because there's enough complexity in those language acts to make it interesting. So most of that research so far has found that when AI has been used in the workplace, they've seen productivity increases, measured usually in speed, time. They haven't necessarily seen quality improvements, measured in a more qualitative way, typically, and that the biggest gains are for the least capable and least productive. So if you're a fairly low performer, this is a game changer for you. If you're good, maybe not so much. I don't know whether each of you have seen anything like that in the studies that you've been doing, or in terms of student behavior or student productivity with these technologies.
I don't have any way to measure that in my own classroom, but I can say that's very consistent with, I think, the way that the tools and technologies are being positioned for students to take them up. I mean, I think they're very much being positioned as productivity tools for the writing process to speed things up, to accelerate. Again, not to even really create capacity for new kinds of knowledge, but instead just to get us to the place we already wanted to go more quickly. That's absolutely consistent with, I think, the vision. And it's also consistent with some of the discourse from the IT industry that discusses what these tools are. I think there's there's a carefully managed, marketing around these tools to, position them not as radical, but as extending and amplifying and really sort of focused on, forwarding the knowledge that we already have. So I don't know how that's going to play out with students in my own classes. It's interesting though, like as a graduate director, there's been a sense from a lot of our faculty members that people like applying to graduate degrees are using these for writing samples and, for those sorts of really strange genres that exist. And so, I mean, I think you're right that they're being used a lot.
John, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't agree with the premise. Not to be like too direct, but I don't think that we're actually seeing some studies out now. I just dropped one in the link, and there's some other ones out there that people aren't more productive. It's this perception from like CEOs and managers that it'll make things more productive. And it's not surprising. I've had students anecdotally say to me like, I had to work to get it to make workable text.
Yep.
I've had to like spend more time on it than actually writing it. And so the course that I taught with that was about AI was a tech writing course, a first year tech writing course. It was a first year. And I got permission from like the dean to theme it around AI. I went off the standard syllabus. And the students didn't want to be in that class. They were happy that they were in it, but they were like, yeah, it doesn't really make me more productive. It can like give me ideas and stuff. And then like the English majors were like, this makes me way less productive because as an English major, right, I actually have generally like a firm grasp of the kind of writer that I am. So I had I was taught my other course was about social media management, and there were a lot of novelists in that class. And they were like, I don't have a problem writing a lot of words. I have a problem writing good words.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT doesn't immediately produce good words. Sometimes it never produces good words. And so, just this past month in July, I had been reading several studies about that what the workers are saying is quite different than what the managers are saying. And the managers are like, look, I can just give you all this stuff. But the workers are like, look, I have to iterate with it more. If I'm expected to use it, then I have to go like check it, and that sort of thing. So I don't think it's necessarily makes people more productive. Also, then of course we can say, what is productive? Is it just, production of you can write 500 or 1,000 words faster? Sure, but are they any better?
Right.
And those are questions that, writing studies, I think, has been asking for years.
I
Yeah.
have
And
one more interesting thing to say related to this. I didn't put anything in this talk about the kind of processes that I saw evidence of, but there's a lot of tool layering that happens too. So it's like when you invite text generation software, suddenly you then need to use another tool to re-paraphrase the text in order to make sure it can get past an AI detector. And then you need to redo that text in certain ways in order to make sure so it's just like every other like domestic technologies, for example. Once you have the one technology, there tend to be about 7 that are needed in order to make that one run effectively. And so I can also tell you there's some really interesting things going on with Quillbot and lots of other different technologies that get layered on the top of generative AI that really extend the process in ways that always take much longer than if someone were able to actually just write it.
excellent. That was a great response to that prompt. So we got like 2 minutes left. So we're in for the lightning round, right? So in as few words as possible, right? So I'd like to know, what are you most worried about and what are you most excited about?
As a person or as like a researcher, scholar, or a teacher? Like,
You get to choose. You get to choose. You can give us both
you want to go
answers.
first, Stacey?
I think we're both people that like to riff off of others instead of going first. I think I'm most worried about just the industry developments and the, seeing how s- seeing how students are able to I don't know. I'm not going to be able to say it in a lightning round kind of way, but just seeing how the industry will develop over time, how students' attention will be able to be managed as these tools become more robust. I'm most excited about just seeing what this does to writing process, to seeing to if people become more willing to think dialogically about writing throughout the process, I think. And, in general, I'm always interested in technologies and how students are learning about them and all the new cool things they're going to do that we could never even have imagined.
Thank you, Stacey. All right, John, you get the final word, the lightning.
So I mean, the thing I'm most excited about, and I'm going to take like a very writing studies. I see there's like in the attendees, there's like there's a lot of people in writing studies, names I recognize. I've never heard the world more interested in writing than now. And like Bill Hart Davidson, I'll give a shout out to him. Um, he and I were having conversations before he passed away. But like this is like an opportunity for like writing studies to use like AI as like a backdoor into talking about things that we want to talk about because finally there are grants that are out there. Like I've never seen more potential for writing studies than now. Of like people are like yeah, I'm being asked like what my opinion is and why like people suddenly care about writing studies and about all this writing theory that we do. Um, and so I think that there's a lot of practical opportunities to apply for grants and to do empirical studies of questions that we might never been able to get funded before that, we could remember our original research agenda without AI and just sort of slide it into this AI hype and try to get stuff about process oriented stuff answered. Um, and then the thing I'm most concerned about is that thing I said about, young writers who are, in late elementary school, middle school, who are gonna just have these technologies naturalized and their outputs is like, oh, this is the way professionals write. And like I'm really worried that we're gonna see them in 6 to 8 years and they're just gonna think, well, this is good writing. And we're gonna have to sort of introduce them to like there's multiple ways to be a good writer.
Yeah. Well, let me pick up on to close Bill's insight there because it was one that he and I shared at Wide, and it's kind of a plea to our writing studies colleagues. It's been exceedingly frustrating to become an old man in a field that hasn't engaged in these explicit public writing technology moments when they emerge. We don't make enough technology. We don't study enough technology. We don't engage in these very public conversations about what these writing technologies and writing spaces do to and for human beings. So this is not a moment to have a disciplinary moment and stick your head down into the field and just beaver away. This is a moment to engage publicly in big questions about what it means to write and what it means to be a human being. So in Bill's spirit, he would want us all to do that in a very explicit way. So keep going, keep making technologies, keep engaged in the world. Stacey and John, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I learned so much. I filled up 2 pages in my notebook in a very analog way with things that I learned from you. So I trust that others who joined us, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
It was
Yeah,
a
it was
pleasure.
lots of fun.
All right. Well, good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you are. Go do something important and do something meaningful. It was great to talk to you. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.